This is the DarwinFPV Baby Ape. It's a little 3-inch quadcopter. Costs $80. And normally at that price point, I might be suspicious that the quality was pretty poor. But it's gotten some really good reviews from guys I really trust, like Nick Burns seemed to really love it. So I have got the Baby Ape, obviously, because I'm making this video. And I'm going to review it. But before I review it, I've got to set it up. And so I'm doing this setup video for you because in the review, potentially, I'm going to say this is a really, really good quadcopter for $80, and a lot of people might consider getting it as their very first quadcopter. And if that's the case, then you're going to need to know how to set it up, and I'm going to show you how to do it. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. The first thing we got to do with this guy is get a receiver installed in it. So a lot of quadcopters are sold in bind and fly versions, which it just means they have the receiver pre-installed. It's not truly bind and fly. Nothing in this hobby is truly bind and fly, where literally you just bind it and boom, you're in the air going. There's always some work you got to do, thank God, because it keeps guys like me in business. We got to install a receiver in this one. It is only sold in what's called a plug-and-play version, and that means that it comes without a receiver and you install your own. And the first thing I've noticed is these are not hex screws, they are Phillips screws. Fine, not a problem. We'll go ahead and remove these. And unfortunately, that does mean that some soldering is going to be involved. And as somebody who is maybe thinking about your very first quadcopter and whether this should be it, that may scare you off a little bit. The reality is that you will always have to. Oh wait, don't take those. These screws here, 1, 2, 3, 4, are holding the video transmitter on, I think. Let's not take those out. I think the top plate can come off without removing those. Hold on. Okay. So we'll take out 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. I was saying, you're going to have to learn to solder if you're going to be in this hobby. That's just, there's no way around it. I have a soldering tutorial. I'll put a link in the video description. I specifically made it for beginners and tried to make it just detailed enough that you would get the information you need without making it too much of a college course. Let's see if this will lift off. I'm going to be real careful because there are some wires here between the flight controller and the video transmitter. So we'll make sure I don't pull on those. And let's see, which way does it? There we go. Oh yeah, we even got this antenna wire here. We definitely don't want to snag that or tug or break that. We'll be real careful not to pull on these wires. Just gently set that aside. In fact, what if I were to just lift this off here? That's just friction fit. So we can just, there we go. There we go. Now we will not stress. There we go. Very nice. So in keeping with the theme of what if this is your very first quad and you're just getting into the hobby, the receiver is the thing that receives the stick movements from the transmitter, or controller as it's often called, and then sends them to the flight controller, which then makes the quadcopter fly. And which receiver you're going to install on this is going to depend on which controller you've got. Different controllers have different protocols that they support: Free Sky, Fly Sky, Spectrum, etc., etc., etc. And you would need a controller or receiver that is compatible with your controller. Now, the receiver we're going to be installing on this one is using a protocol called Express ELRS. And I'm of the opinion that Express ELRS is what budget-minded beginners should be thinking about using. It is not the easiest to use. In fact, it has a couple of hoops you got to jump through with the computer to get it working that some people are going to find a little bit cumbersome. But it is approximately half the price of other competing protocols like Crossfire or Ghost. And I think a lot of people getting into the hobby are going to maybe hesitate at the price of those protocols and will jump at the price of Express ELRS. The other cool thing about Express ELRS is it has these tiny, tiny receivers, and they even have an antenna. This little thing here is the antenna, and so installing and mounting them is so easy compared to some of the bigger receivers on some of the other protocols. So let's see here. I reckon that we're going to mount this maybe on the underside here. So here's how I'm going to solder the wires to the receiver. They go ground, 5 volts, TX, and then RX. I've got white for TX and yellow for RX. You don't have to do it that way, but that's how I'm doing it just because those are the colors of wires that I had handy. If you need to pick up a wire kit, the specific wire that we're using is fine-stranded silicon insulation wire, which is what's recommended for this type of, for quadcopters and aircraft. If you need to pick that up, or if you need to pick up any of the other stuff that I'm using, I'll put links in the video description. I also have a website, fpvknowitall.com, which is linked in the video description below, where I have a full parts list for tools that I use and supplies that I use, like this blue, what's this stuff? This blue tack. That's all on my website, fpvknowitall.com. Well, we soldered the wires up, and you can take a look real quick here. Just make sure you get it the right way around. This is the side without the antenna, right? And we've got the big chip here, whatever, on the right side. And we go from right to left, ground, 5 volt, TX, RX. The next thing we need to do is identify where on the flight controller of the quad that we need to solder these wires to. And on this flight controller, I can see there is a label, S-Bus, 5 volt, and a minus sign is ground, and that's telling us these 3 pads are going to be used for an S-Bus receiver. S-Bus is a receiver type used by FreeSky radios, among others, and it's one of the most common, and that's why you'll see a dedicated S-Bus pad on many flight controllers. Now, we are not going to be using S-Bus, but that does give us a sense of where the flight controller designer expected the receiver to solder up. If we continue to look nearby to there, we can also see RX1, TX1, and 3.3 volts. And these are also used for a receiver. So for a FreeSky receiver, we would use S-Bus, 5 volt, and ground. For the Express ELRS receiver, we're going to use TX1 and RX1. The way to wire up each receiver is different. For example, why aren't we using 3.3 volts? Well, this receiver takes 5 volts. Well, how do you know that? I've got another video, flight controller wiring for beginners, which takes you through some of these ins and outs of wiring up a flight controller, which you're welcome to watch if you want to get a better perspective on sort of how I make these decisions. But we are going to be using the TX and the RX, and then we're also going to use the 5 volt and ground as well. But we're not going to use S-Bus, and we're not going to use 3.3 volts. That's what this flight controller needs. And this, no lie, this is some fiddly soldering. I'm going to really think about how to approach this, because it would be really easy to go in here with a soldering iron tip and damage some of this stuff. Can't help but notice that these pads have already been soldered on too. I wonder if this is a returned unit, or if someone test flew this. I don't know. So the first thing I'm going to do is this is called tinning the pad. Just get a little bit of solder on the pad, and this stuff that you saw me putting on was called flux, and I go into all of that in my soldering tutorial, which is linked in the video description below. That's not a great solder joint, but I'm going to take it. That one's better. When soldering up a receiver or any of the other digital peripherals that are used on quadcopters, you're going to solder up a TX and an RX wire. And one of the confusing things is that TX on the one goes to RX on the other, and vice versa. Normally you would connect 5 volt to 5 volt, ground to ground, and so on. So in this case, we've got the pinout from the receiver is white is TX, yellow is RX, because the order goes ground, 5 volt, TX, RX. So white is TX, it's going to go to RX on the flight controller. And here is the result. That's some fiddly soldering for your first quadcopter, I do admit. You should practice soldering anyway, right? Yeah, that's it. You're going to practice. You're going to get so good at soldering before you even think about getting in the air. You're going to be so good. You're going to nail that. You're going to spend 2 months learning how to solder. People ask, why are you learning to solder? You say, well, I'm going to fly quadcopters. I say, well, why you got to solder? Don't you just get a DJI quadcopter? You'd be like, shut up. I'm going to fly. I'm not going to drive a tripod in the sky. I'm flying an acro quad. They'd be like, okay, get your hands off me. It's not that big a deal. This stuff is Scotch Extreme Mounting Tape. Again, it's on my website. Link in the video description to my website. There's a supplies page where I list all this stuff. We're just going to take a double layer of that. I like to use a double layer because it just gives a little more squishiness and I think helps it stick a little better. And we're going to just attach that to the back end of the top plate. Be real careful not to push on the antenna and break the antenna, which would be easy to do. We're just going to flippity, 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 flippity. Wiggle, 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 wiggle. And it should stick real damn good. No, it's not sticking that good after all. What are we doing here? Stick. It's probably stuck pretty good now. Yeah, there we go. Alrighty. Now the controller that I'm working with in this video is the Jumper T-Lite, and I have installed an Express LRS module on the back of it. I've got a separate video if you happen to have this exact controller and this module about how to set it up. I've chosen this one because I think this is also a good choice for a beginner. It's inexpensive, it's reasonable quality for the price, and has good performance. So I'm not going to walk you through that. I'll link that video down in the video description below. But what I'm going to want to do is power it up. OpenTX. And don't mind that. Now, unfortunately, they've done a weird thing with this receiver, and that is they have put the status LED on the underside from the antenna, which the antenna is always going to be facing out. So you can still kind of see the status LED, but it's kind of buried up in there. And when I power it up, it is solid LED. It is bound to my controller, and that's good. Everything is working. That's what we want to see. If we see a blinking LED or a fast flashing LED, it means that the controller and the receiver are not bound. That means they're not talking to each other, and you need to go through that process. I've got more about how to do that in my setup video for this controller, or I have a series of Express LRS tutorials. Or if you're using something else, I probably have tutorials about that too. But basically, we need to see that the receiver is bound to the controller and we can proceed. Well, the next thing we got to do is go into Betaflight and tell the flight controller how to recognize our receiver. If you need to download Betaflight Configurator, that's the app that I'm using here. I'll put a link in the video description. It installs just like any other app on, well, Windows is the one I have experience with. Oh, there we go. It's on the underside. We'll go ahead and plug that into USB. And I will just hit the connect button here and we will connect. And what we need to do is go into the ports tab and we need to tell it which of the UARTs we connected the receiver to. You know, where we saw TX1, RX1 when we soldered up the wires. That is going to be UART number 1 because it's TX transmit 1 and a receiver 1. That means it's on UART 1, and we want serial RX to be enabled on UART 1, and it is enabled by default. This thing only has 2 UARTs, so there's not a lot of places to go wrong, so that's good. At this point, the next thing we got to do is tell the flight controller what type of receiver we've got. In this case, it's what protocol that the receiver is going to talk to it. And there's going to be a little bit of variance here, depending on which version of Betaflight you've got. You see, Betaflight 4.3 is about to release. In fact, by the time you're seeing this, it probably already is out. And when they released Betaflight 4.3, they changed where some of these options are in the configurator. So I am going to go to the receiver tab, and in the receiver tab there's this section receiver where I can tell it what type of receiver I've got, and I'm going to change that from SBus to Crossfire CRSF. That is the protocol that Express LRS uses to talk to the flight controller. That's the correct value for there. Depending on what type of receiver you are installed, you would choose the correct protocol there. However, hang on, let me just save and reboot that. However, in older versions of Betaflight, that option was in the configuration tab. It's the same option, it looks the same, it's just in a slightly different place. So it would be here if you're on an older version of Betaflight than 4.3. If you're in, I have configurator 10.8.0. If you have configurator 10.7, it's going to be in the configuration tab. Unfortunate that there's been a little bit of shuffling to add that to the probably ample confusion. Now that that's done, if I'm just going to power cycle my quad after turning on my controller. So I'm going to turn on my controller.
Welcome to OpenTX.
And then I'm going to power cycle the quad. You can see the receiver is fast flashing, and that means the receiver has gone into Wi-Fi update mode. It's waiting for a firmware update. So we're just going to power cycle the receiver by plugging and unplugging USB. The LED on the receiver should go solid yellow. There we go. It goes solid yellow, meaning it is bound. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take our controller. We're going to go to the receiver tab, and we should see movement in the receiver tab as I move the sticks. Yay! Okay, now at this point, the next thing we need to do is we need to set our channel endpoints, we need to set our channel mapping, and we need to set up our aux modes. And I've got other videos that go through those steps. They're the same for pretty much all quadcopters. So I'm going to link those videos down below if you need to set them up. Mine are... they need a little work. My channel mapping is correct. Throttle, yaw, pitch, and roll is correct, but my endpoints are not correct. When I lower the throttle, it goes to 988. It should be 1000. When I raise the throttle, it goes to 2011. It should be 2000. So rather than duplicate that effort, I'll put a link in the video description to how to set that up. And then the next thing after that we need to do is we need to set up our aux modes. And what that means is make it so that when we flip the switches, the quadcopter arms, disarms, and other things. And again, I have a video about how to do that, and I'm going to put that in the video description below. There is one gotcha with this radio that I need you to be aware of as you watch those other tutorial videos, and that is the buttons on this radio are a little different than the buttons on the radio that I'm using in the tutorial. So in the video, I will tell you to press the menu key, and this button here, the model button, is equivalent to the menu key that I'm going to have you press in that tutorial video, setting up your aux modes and such. And then there is a page key. I'll say press the page key to switch pages. And the way this radio is set up is that the model key moves you sort of to the right. If you look here in the upper right, you'll see it says 4 out of 12. It's page 4. We're going to page 5, 6. And then on this radio, the sys key is sort of like page back. They're really unfortunately labeled, but you can see I can move to the left, page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And that's a little bit different. On other radios, there's a menu key and a page key, and the page key only goes one way. Anyway, so that interface is slightly different than you'll see in the tutorial, but I'm confident that you'll be able to figure that out. Now, there are a couple other little changes that I'm going to suggest you make that are different from the way that DarwinFPV ships this. There's nothing wrong with the way they ship it, but there are little tweaks that I like to make. One of them is I like to change the craft name. The name will show up in the on-screen display in the goggles, so you can put your pilot handle or something like that. I'll just put JB. I like to turn off the maximum arm angle. So the quadcopter ships with a safeguard where if the quad is not flat, it will refuse to arm. And the idea is that if you're carrying it in your hand and you accidentally flip the arm switch, it'll prevent it from arming and potentially hurting you. Well, there's two things going on here. Number one, on these little 3-inch quadcopters, the props, I'm not like volunteering to get chopped up by them, but they're not as dangerous as like a 5-inch, which can really mess you up. And the other thing is I just like to be careful with the arm switch, and it can be really annoying if you set the quad down and like it's on a rock or something, it's slightly uneven and it refuses to arm. So I like to set the maximum arm angle in the configuration tab to 180, and that will disable that option. The quadcopter doesn't have a beeper on board. So it can't, if you lose it, especially with a little quad, you could lose it in the grass or something if you crash. What you can do is you can go to the D-Shot beacon configuration in the configuration tab, and you can enable RX lost and RX set, and that will cause the motors to beep. They're not very big motors and they're not going to be very loud, but it will be better than nothing and may help you find the quad. The other thing you can do is you can just arm the quad if you've lost it and just try and spin the motors, and it'll make a little bit of a thrashing noise, and hopefully you'll be able to find it. The Baby Ape doesn't seem to ship with anything interesting in the OSD, and I have a particular OSD setup that I like to use. And what I can do is just, I have a text file where I save that stuff, and I'm just going to copy paste all this stuff. I'll put this in the video description if you want to copy paste it as well. And while I'm at it, I'm going to copy my rates in as well. These are my rates. This is the command line configuration for this stuff, and just by copy pasting it into the CLI, it makes it easy for me to set my quads up the same. Ta-da! Save. Let's just grab a battery here and plug this in and see if the video transmitter is working. And I've got this little screen here what we can do is we can go to the video transmitter tab. Looks like the quad is on race 8, so we'll just change to race band 8. Sure enough, it locked in. I don't know if you can see this very easily, but do you see how the OSD is not at the bottom of the screen? That's because the preset I pasted in was not set correctly. So I'm just going to drag this down and get that all sorted out. That's because my preset is set up for a different kind of camera. That's fine. No big deal. Looking good. Looking good. Yeah. I think we're ready to try this out. So the next thing I'm going to do is, with props off, I'm just going to plug her in. And I'm just going to test arming and disarming. Seems... Oh, I can even... Oh, yeah, well, that's normal. I can... It didn't like that I was trying to jiggle it around with no props on, and it was like, F this, and it shut off. But that's normal. It is. I can even see the motors speed up and slow down by the brightness of the LEDs. Yep, everything is working correctly. Oh, my beeping's work. Everything's working correctly. We are ready to take this sucker out and go fly it. Before we do that, we would need to put props. Thank you. But we need to put props on it. Let me just check something. Oh, that's important. Yeah, you got to put your props on correctly. So this is set up for...
Telemetry recovered.
Thank you. This is set up for props in rotation. If you take a look right here, this is the direction the props or the motors are spinning, and that tells you how the props should be installed. If you need further instruction about that, I have a video, Props for Noobs. How much could there be to say about props? Well, if you install them wrong, you'll find out. So you may want to check that video out if you don't know how to install your props correctly. I'll link in the video description, of course. And of course, I will also be reviewing this quad. In fact, by the time I put this tutorial out, I probably will also have released the review video. So take a look for that on my channel. Definitely make sure that you're subscribed and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of the awesome content that I'm making. I don't know why I roll my eyes. It's awesome content. Shut up. If you're interested in picking up this quad, well, you probably already have if you watch this video all the way to the end. But if you haven't, there's a link in the video description to stores where you can buy it. Thanks so much for watching. Happy flying. Do you see this baby? Isn't he cute? Hit the subscribe button. Join my Patreon. Use my affiliate links. Or just keep watching videos. That's better than nothing. Go, go, gaga, subscribe to my daddy.